The door burst open so hard it cracked against the interior wall, and Pauline Wainwright spun around from the fireplace with her heart already climbing into her throat. Snow exploded inward with the force of the gale, and there, in the doorway, stood Nathan Hayes, the Marshal of Coldwater Creek, his broad shoulders packed with white, his dark coat nearly invisible against the storm raging at his back. His face was raw and red from the cold, his jaw set in that particular way she had come to recognize as a man fighting something deep inside himself, something he had not yet decided whether to surrender to or destroy. She had told him to go. She had stood in this very room 3 hours ago and told him that she did not need him, that she had never needed him, that the secrets he kept and the walls he built around himself were something she refused to spend the rest of her life trying to climb over. She had told him to ride out and keep riding and not look back, and she had meant every word of it, or at least she had believed she meant every word of it when she said it. He stood there dripping onto her floorboards, breathing hard, and the look on his face was not anger. It was not pride. It was something worse than either, something that cracked her open despite herself. It was the look of a man who had tried to do what she asked and had discovered that he could not. "I got 1 mile out," Nathan Hayes said, his voice low and rough as broken gravel, "before I could not keep going." The blizzard screamed behind him. The candle on the mantel guttered wildly. Pauline stood with her hands pressed flat against her thighs to keep them from shaking, and every word she had planned to say to him if he ever came back dissolved like sugar in rain. He had ridden back through the blizzard. He had ridden back for her. But she needed to understand how they had arrived at this moment, at this doorway, at this terrible, beautiful, impossible reckoning, because it had not happened overnight. It had been building for months, through the dust and the danger and the long, dark secrets between them, and it had nearly destroyed them both before it had the chance to save them. The town of Coldwater Creek sat in the shadow of the Wyoming Rockies, a raw and ambitious little settlement that had sprung up along the bank of a cold, fast river in the late autumn of 1883. It was not yet 5 years old, but it had grown with that particular ferocity that frontier towns seem to possess when they sat at the crossroads of something useful. In this case, the intersection of 2 cattle routes and a recently established mail line that connected it to Cheyenne in the east and Fort Bridger to the west. There were perhaps 300 souls in Coldwater Creek that year, not counting the ranchers and homesteaders spread across the surrounding valleys, and among those 300, the most visible and the most discussed was Nathan Hayes, the town's marshal for the past 2 years. He was not a man who invited discussion of himself. He was 34 years old, broad through the chest and shoulders in the way of men who had done physical work all their lives, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that had been weathered by sun and hardship into something severe but not unkind. He spoke rarely and precisely, and the people of Coldwater Creek had learned that when Nathan Hayes said a thing he meant it, and when he was silent about a thing, there was generally a reason for the silence that was not their business to investigate. He wore his badge on his coat with the same lack of ceremony with which other men wore buttons, and he kept the peace in Coldwater Creek with a combination of physical authority, tactical intelligence, and a reputation for absolute fairness that was, in the wildly unfair landscape of the American West in 1883, almost radical. His dark past was something he did not discuss. People had pieced together fragments over 2 years. He had served as a deputy in Abilene, Kansas, during the cattle drive years, which meant he had seen things that aged a man faster than the calendar could account for. He had been involved in something in Laramie, some enforced choice between law and loyalty that had cost him something, though no one in Coldwater Creek could say precisely what. There were rumors of a wife, dead or gone, no one agreed on which. There were rumors of a killing he carried guilt about, justified or not, no one agreed on that either. What everyone agreed on was that Nathan Hayes was a man who kept his own counsel, did his job with uncommon dedication, and seemed to have made a private decision sometime in his past that he was not entitled to the softer things in life. That private decision was the first thing Pauline Wainwright challenged, though she did not know it when she first arrived. She had come to Coldwater Creek in September of 1883 on the Cheyenne mail coach, which was an experience she would later describe as 11 hours of being shaken like a jar of dried beans over terrain that seemed personally hostile to the concept of roads. She was 26 years old, dark-haired and serious-faced, with steady gray eyes that people frequently underestimated because they expected a woman who looked like her to be meeker than she turned out to be. She had grown up in Cincinnati, Ohio, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died when Pauline was 15, and she had spent the 10 years since her mother's death becoming practical in the way that women who lose their softening influence early tend to become practical. She could cook, sew, manage accounts, handle a horse, and read Latin, which was an unusual combination even in Cincinnati and a remarkable one in Wyoming. She had come west for a position. She had answered a notice published in the Cincinnati Gazette by a Reverend Marcus Abel of Coldwater Creek, Wyoming Territory, seeking a schoolteacher for the town's new one-room schoolhouse to open in the fall. The position paid $18 a month plus board, which was more than she was earning at the bookbinding workshop in Cincinnati, and the notice had included a line that lodged itself in her mind and would not leave. This is a young country, and it needs people who are not afraid of being part of building something. She was not afraid of that. She was very much afraid of remaining in Cincinnati for the rest of her life, assembling the spines of other people's books. The first time she saw Nathan Hayes, he was standing outside the livery stable on the main street of Coldwater Creek, speaking with a rancher named Holt about a stolen horse. She had stepped down from the mail coach still dusty from the journey, her traveling case in hand, and she had looked around at the raw wooden buildings and the mud-churned street and the enormous sky pressing down on everything with its particular western weight. And then she had looked at the man in the dark coat with the silver star, and something in her chest had done a thing she could not immediately name. He did not look at her. He was absorbed in his conversation with the rancher, and his attention when he gave it to a thing was apparently total. She noted the set of his jaw, the economy of his gestures, the way he stood as if he had grown there. Then Reverend Abel materialized at her elbow to welcome her, and she was swept into the business of arrival, and she told herself that whatever her chest had done was simply the disorientation of a woman who had been traveling for 11 days and needed a hot meal and a bed. She told herself that for approximately 2 weeks, which was how long it took for Nathan Hayes to actually speak to her. He came to the schoolhouse on a Wednesday afternoon in early October, when the aspen trees along the creek were burning gold, and the days still held warmth even as the nights bit hard. School had been in session for 3 weeks by then, and Pauline had 11 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, which required a curriculum flexible enough to accommodate readers and arithmetic at every level simultaneously, which it turned out she was good at. She was erasing the chalkboard when the door opened and Nathan Hayes came in, hat in hand, ducking slightly because the doorframe was built for shorter ambitions. "Miss Wainwright," he said. "Marshal Hayes," she said, because she had learned his name within 24 hours of her arrival in the way that one naturally learned the names of the most prominent people in a small place. He told her he needed to speak to her about a student, a boy named Billy Crane, 12 years old, whose father worked at the mill and whose home situation was one that the marshal had become aware of in his professional capacity. He said it plainly and without embellishment, that the boy's father drank and that there were concerns, and he asked if she had noticed anything in the boy's behavior at school that he should know about. She had in fact noticed several things: the fading bruise behind Billy's left ear, the way the boy flinched when another child raised a hand quickly, the lunches he sometimes had and sometimes did not have. She told Nathan Hayes these things with equal plainness, and she watched him listen the way he apparently listened to everything, with complete and focused attention, and she felt something shift between them that was not romantic yet but was something before romantic, the recognition of two people who approached the world with the same quality of seriousness. They spoke for 30 minutes. He thanked her. He left. She stood at the window and watched him walk back up the main street toward his office, and she thought, there is a man carrying a great deal, and she did not mean his physical stature. After that, they spoke regularly. It began as a professional arrangement, a school teacher and a marshal sharing information about the welfare of children in a small frontier community, where the lines between civic institutions were drawn loosely, because there were not yet enough institutions to draw them clearly. He would stop by the schoolhouse in the evening sometimes, after she had finished for the day, and they would stand on the small porch and talk about the town, about the students, about the particular challenges of trying to administer law in a place where law was still young enough to be contested. She found him difficult and fascinating in equal measure. He had opinions that he expressed only when directly asked, but when he expressed them, they were carefully considered and frequently surprising. He had read more than she expected, and he remembered what he read with the kind of precision that suggested he had spent a lot of his life in places where books were rare and therefore valuable. She started leaving a lamp in the schoolhouse window on evenings when she was there, which was not an arrangement they had ever made explicitly but which he began to notice, and which he began to use as a signal to stop. In November, the weather changed. The warmth fell away abruptly, the way it does in Wyoming with a particular ruthlessness that Easterners always find shocking, and the first proper snowstorm hit Coldwater Creek on a Tuesday night, 6 inches by morning with more coming. Pauline had moved into the small set of rooms behind the schoolhouse that served as her lodging, and she had been preparing for the cold with the diligence of a woman who had been warned that Wyoming winters were not Ohio winters. She had laid in enough wood and provisions, or thought she had. The storm revealed that her woodpile was going to run short by February if the winter ran long. Nathan Hayes showed up on the first clear day after the storm with 2 men from the mill and 3 wagon loads of split timber, which he directed to be stacked against the back wall of the schoolhouse without ceremony or comment, as if he simply happened to be passing by with 3 wagon loads of wood. She came outside when she heard the noise and stood watching him direct the stacking with the same brisk efficiency he brought to everything, and she felt something that was no longer just professional recognition. It had become something warmer and more dangerous. "You did not have to do this," she said. "The teacher cannot teach if she has frozen," he said, without looking up from the stack he was checking. "I would have managed." He finally looked at her then with those dark eyes that held more than they gave away. "I do not doubt it," he said, "but there was no need for you to manage alone." She thought about that sentence for 3 days. Through November and into December, the thing between them continued to deepen in the particular way that things deepen when 2 careful people are both aware of what is happening, and neither is yet ready to name it. They shared evenings at the schoolhouse porch until the cold drove them inside, where she would make coffee over the small stove, and they would sit at opposite ends of the student benches and talk. She learned things about him slowly, in the way that a creek erodes a stone, not by any sudden dramatic revelation, but by the patient accumulation of small truths. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a blacksmith. He had gone west at 19 with nothing but a horse and a considerable capacity for hard work. He had been a cowboy, a driver, a deputy, a marshal. He had been married briefly to a woman named Clara, who had died of typhoid fever in Abilene in 1877, 3 months after their wedding. He spoke of this without obvious grief, but with the careful precision of a man who had arranged his grief somewhere internal, where it did not interfere with his function, but where it had hardened into something permanent. She told him about Cincinnati, about her father and his schoolroom, about her mother's death when she was 15, about the particular loneliness of being capable and purposeful in a world that kept trying to tell her that capable and purposeful were not the qualities a woman was supposed to prioritize. He listened to all of it with the same focused attention he gave everything, and when she finished he said, "You came a long way on your own." "I preferred my own company to the alternative," she said, "which was marrying someone I did not respect and spending my life being smaller than I am." He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "I understand that." She believed him. The thing that broke open between them happened in December, and it happened because of a man named Desmond Hatch. Hatch had arrived in Coldwater Creek 3 weeks earlier, presenting himself as a land surveyor from the territorial office, and he had been staying at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Pratt. He was a smooth man, well-dressed by frontier standards, with a manner that was agreeable on the surface and calculating underneath, the way some men are who have learned that charm is a more efficient tool than force in most situations. He had introduced himself to Pauline at the general store, and he had been attentive and flattering in a way she found exhausting rather than flattering, because she was good at recognizing the difference between a man who was interested in her and a man who was interested in what he could get from being interested in her. She had not thought much about Hatch beyond that assessment until Nathan Hayes came to the schoolhouse one evening in early December with a look on his face that was different from his usual controlled expression. There was tension in it, a coiled, alert quality that she associated with his professional manner rather than his personal one. He told her about Hatch, and the telling was one of the first times she understood fully the weight of the secrets Nathan Hayes carried in his capacity as marshal. Hatch was not a land surveyor. He was known in Cheyenne and 2 other territories as a man who operated on the edges of legitimacy, who found ways to deprive homesteaders and small landowners of their property through a combination of legal manipulation and quiet intimidation, buying up land at criminal prices from people who had been convinced by manufactured paperwork that they owed debts they did not owe. Nathan had received a wire from the sheriff in Cheyenne 2 days earlier. Hatch had been looking at properties in the Coldwater Creek Valley, and specifically the wire suggested at the section of land along the North Fork of the creek where 3 homesteader families had their claims, families who had been there for 3 years and had built something real. "What are you going to do?" Pauline asked. "I am going to watch him," Nathan said. "I cannot arrest a man for what I suspect. I need what he does, not what I know. And if he makes his move before you have what you need, then I will need to improvise," he said, and the grimness in his voice told her that improvisation in this context was not something he looked forward to. She said, "Is there something I can do?" He looked at her with that direct, assessing gaze. "No," he said, "I need you to stay out of it." That was the moment she should have listened to him. She would later think about this with a complex mixture of pride and regret, because what happened next was both her best quality and the quality that brought them to the edge of something that nearly cost them everything. She did not stay out of it. Hatch, she learned from Mrs. Pratt in the way that women learn things from each other in small towns, had been asking questions about the land deeds for several properties, including the schoolhouse and the lot it sat on. The schoolhouse lot had been granted by the town council, but the documentation was apparently incomplete, which was not unusual for a young settlement where record-keeping was still catching up with the pace of establishment. Pauline understood land documentation because her father had taught her to read legal documents as a practical skill when she was young, and she spent 2 evenings reading through every piece of paperwork she could find related to the town's land grants. What she found was that the schoolhouse lot documentation did have a gap, a missing secondary signature on the original plat that would technically leave the grant contestable under territorial law. She brought this to Reverend Abel, who brought it to the town council, who brought it to Nathan Hayes with the kind of late-night urgency that suggested they had all been somewhat more alarmed than they wanted to admit. Nathan Hayes appeared at her door at 8 o'clock that evening with a look on his face that was new to her. She had seen his controlled expressions, his professional expressions, and the occasional glimpse of something warmer underneath. This was none of those. This was a man who was angry, and who was keeping the anger tightly reined, and who was angry at her specifically. "I told you to stay out of it," he said. "I found the gap in the schoolhouse deed," she said. "Would you rather I had not found it? I would rather you had not been looking in places that could have made you visible to a man who has a history of threatening people who make themselves inconvenient to him." She stood her ground. "And I would rather have been useful than protected." The anger and something else fought across his face for a visible moment. Then he exhaled, a controlled breath, and he said, "The deed issue is something we can fix. The council will call an emergency session tomorrow." "Thank you for finding it." He paused. "But Pauline, I need you to understand that Hatch is not a man who responds reasonably to opposition. If he realizes you are the one who found this and brought it forward, he will see you as a problem to be managed." It was the first time he had called her by her given name. She noted it with the careful attention she gave to everything about him, filed it, and addressed the practical matter at hand. "Then let us make sure he does not realize it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, the anger in his face gave way to something that looked almost like helpless recognition, the expression of a man who had been trying to keep a careful distance from something, and had just discovered that the distance had closed without his noticing. The next weeks were among the most intense of Pauline Wainwright's life, and they were intense in two simultaneous registers that wound around each other in a way she found both thrilling and deeply unsettling. On the practical level, Nathan Hayes moved against Desmond Hatch with the systematic patience of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He coordinated with the Cheyenne sheriff through a series of wires. He documented Hatch's movements, and he set a trap, a carefully constructed arrangement in which two of the homesteader families were quietly advised to wait for an approach from Hatch, while Nathan positioned himself to witness and record anything that crossed the line from aggressive business into criminal conduct. The forced choice he had spoken of, the need to have the action and not just the knowledge, was resolved on a cold afternoon in mid-December when Hatch presented forged territorial documents to a homesteader named Frank Greer, documents that purported to show a 3-year-old lien on Greer's land, with Nathan Hayes observing through the window of Greer's sod house and two witnesses present inside. Hatch was arrested, wired to Cheyenne, and out of Coldwater Creek before Christmas. On the other level, the one that concerned Pauline more deeply, everything between her and Nathan Hayes had shifted into a new register of intimacy and tension that neither of them was managing particularly gracefully. He had been coming to the schoolhouse in the evenings throughout the Hatch business, partly because it was useful for coordinating and partly, she suspected, because something in him had decided that the distance was no longer either possible or desirable. But he maintained a careful formality, even as the conversations grew longer and more personal, even as the space between them on the student benches seemed to diminish without any conscious decision to diminish it. He talked about his past with more openness now, the years in Kansas, the things he had witnessed and done and was not fully at peace with, the killing in Laramie that had been legally justified and morally complicated, and that he had carried ever since. She listened to all of it with the steady attention she brought to difficult things, and she did not look away from any of it, and she understood from the way he watched her not look away that this meant something to him. But he did not cross the careful line he had drawn. He was courteous, attentive, warm in his controlled way, and entirely without any overt gesture that could be read as courtship, and she began to understand that this was not indifference. It was something she found both touching and deeply frustrating, the self-denial of a man who had decided that he was not entitled to want things. She had started to push against that decision, carefully, the way she pushed against anything she found unreasonable. She had let conversations run later. She had stopped ending evenings briskly. She had, on one occasion, touched his hand when he showed her a photograph of the Laramie Ridge where the killing had happened, a brief, deliberate contact that she had felt all the way to her shoulder, and he had gone very still for a moment in a way that told her everything about what the touch had done to him. And then December had deepened into something savage. The blizzard warning came on a Monday, passed down the line from Fort Bridger by wire, a storm system from the northwest of a type that the old-timers in Coldwater Creek described with the sober respect of people who had survived previous ones. Provisions were laid in, livestock were brought to shelter, and the town did the practical and efficient things that frontier settlements knew how to do because they had learned the cost of not doing them. On the Tuesday morning, the storm arrived. By Tuesday afternoon, Coldwater Creek was effectively buried. The snow was horizontal, driven by a wind that made sound into a continuous roar, and visibility beyond 10 feet was essentially zero. Pauline was in her rooms behind the schoolhouse, well stocked with wood and food, warm and safe, and going slowly out of her mind with the enforced inactivity. She had written letters, read everything she had available, organized the schoolroom supplies, and was standing at the frost-thick window staring at the white wall of the storm when she heard the knock at her door. It was Nathan Hayes, snow-covered and clearly just arrived from outside, which meant he had walked through the blizzard from the marshal's office on the main street to the schoolhouse at the edge of the settled area, which was not a short walk in ordinary weather. "Is something wrong?" she asked, pulling him inside. "No," he said, and then seemed to realize this required expansion. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." She looked at his snow-covered coat and the red of his face and the snow in his hair and felt something so strong and so sudden that it was almost alarming. "You walked through the blizzard to check on me," she said. "It is my responsibility to check on residents. You have not checked on Mrs. Pratt tonight." He was quiet. "You have not checked on Reverend Abel." Still quiet, that set jaw, those careful eyes. "Nathan," she said, and his name in her mouth felt like a declaration. "I am going to ask you something directly, and I am going to need you to answer me directly." "All right," he said. "What are we doing, you and I? What is this that has been happening between us for 3 months, and why are you so determined to keep it from becoming what it is?" He looked at her for a long time. The fire snapped in the hearth. The storm screamed at the walls. Then he sat down on the bench nearest the stove, still in his snow-wet coat, and he put his hands on his knees and he talked. Really talked, in a way she had not heard from him before, without the controlled economy and without the careful maintenance of appropriate distance. He told her about Clara, not just the fact of Clara's death, but the grief of it and the guilt mixed into the grief. The sense that his life on the frontier, the danger and the violence and the uncertainty of it, had been the condition that brought a woman he loved to a fever ward in Abilene with no one to tend her, because he was 3 days' ride away doing a job that could not wait. He told her about Laramie, the full story, a young man shot in the course of an arrest, a young man who turned out to be 17 and scared and firing a stolen gun at Nathan Hayes in a livery stable, because he had made a terrible, desperate choice and did not know how to unmake it. He told her that he had decided after Laramie that he was a man who carried too much damage to offer a woman anything that was not contaminated by it, that it would not be fair, that whoever she was, she deserved better than what he could provide. Pauline listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed, and her heart doing something large and painful in her chest. And when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That is the most arrogant thing I have ever heard." He stared at her. "You have appointed yourself the judge of what I deserve," she said. "You have decided on my behalf without asking me that I am better off without you. Does it not occur to you that I might be the more appropriate person to make that determination?" "Pauline, I am not finished." She stood up. "I am 26 years old and I have spent my adult life being practical and independent, and I have never wanted a man to manage my choices, and here you are, a man I respect enormously and who I believe has genuine feelings for me, managing my choices for me in the guise of nobility. You are not protecting me. You are protecting yourself. You are using the story of your damage as a reason to not take a risk that frightens you, and you are dressing it up as selflessness." The silence afterward was very thick. The storm continued to throw itself at the walls. Nathan Hayes stared at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something naked and unmanaged, something that looked like a man who had just had a window opened in a room he had kept shuttered for years. "You are not wrong," he said finally. "I know I am not wrong." He stood up. He was very close to her, close enough that she could see the snow melt on his jaw. "I do not know how to do this without hurting you," he said. "I genuinely do not know how." "You cannot know that before you try," she said. "Nobody can." He reached up and touched her face slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who was very aware of what he was doing and had decided to do it anyway. His thumb traced her cheekbone. She held very still, afraid that any sudden movement would break whatever this moment was. His dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she had not felt before by anyone. Then he said quietly, "I am going to try." He kissed her then. Gently, carefully, with the same controlled precision he brought to everything, and she kissed him back with considerably less control, and the blizzard outside went on without either of them noticing it at all. After that, everything was both better and more complicated. It was better because what had been unspoken was now spoken, and because Nathan Hayes, once he had made the decision to try, was not a halfway man. He was attentive and steadfast, and he turned that focused attention to Pauline with an intensity that was almost overwhelming, and that she found, to her own private delight, to be completely mutual. He did not become demonstrative in public, because that was not his nature, and the town of Coldwater Creek was still the kind of place where a marshal's dignity was part of his professional authority. But in private, in the evenings at the schoolhouse, or at the small restaurant run by a Chinese family named Huang where they began to share dinners on Saturday evenings, he was warm and funny in the dry, understated way that she had suspected was always there underneath the severity. And he was capable of a gentleness that consistently surprised her. It was more complicated because of the things in him that did not resolve simply because he had decided to try. The darkness in his past, the weight he carried, the occasional nights when she could see from across a room that he was somewhere else in his mind entirely, somewhere in a livery stable in Laramie or a fever ward in Abilene. She did not try to reach him in those moments, having understood early that reaching for him when he was there made him feel ambushed. She simply stayed nearby and waited, and he always came back. And often when he came back, he would look at her with an expression that mixed relief and gratitude in a way that broke her heart in the good direction. January of 1884 was bitterly cold. It was the kind of Wyoming winter that tested the premise of human settlement in the region, and Coldwater Creek experienced several weeks of temperatures that dropped past anything a thermometer was designed to contemplate with comfort. Pauline taught school in her heaviest woolen dress with her coat on over it and 3 pairs of stockings, and her students arrived each morning with the red faces and cheerful ferocity of children who are too young to fear cold and old enough to find it an adventure. Nathan Hayes, during this period, was managing a tension that had been building in the territory for several months, one of the ongoing injustices of the frontier that operated on a scale too large for a single marshal to resolve, but too immediate to ignore. The land pressure that had brought Desmond Hatch to Coldwater Creek was part of a larger pattern, the expansion of large cattle interests backed by Eastern capital, the pressure on homesteaders and small ranchers who had established claims, and the particular vulnerability of the Shoshone families in the northern valleys, whose rights were being eroded by a combination of negligence and deliberate predation, that the territorial authorities in Cheyenne were not moving quickly enough to address. Nathan wired Cheyenne regularly about it. He documented what he could. He intervened when intervention was within his authority, and he tried to hold the line against the things that were outside it, knowing the line was inadequate. He talked to Pauline about this. She had become, in ways that neither of them had planned and both of them welcomed, his primary thinking partner for the hard problems, the ones that had no clean solution. She was clear-eyed about injustice in a way that he found bracing, without the defensive cynicism that prolonged exposure to injustice can develop in the people who witness it most closely. She was angry about the right things and practical about what could be done and honest about what could not, and her anger and her practicality together were a kind of fuel for him in moments when the weight of what he carried tempted him toward the numb distance he used to maintain. In late January, there was an incident at a Shoshone settlement 12 miles north of Coldwater Creek. Two men, hired hands for one of the large cattle operations, had destroyed a winter cache of food, apparently in an attempt to pressure the settlement toward abandonment. Nathan rode out the morning after he received the report, in temperatures that were dangerous for extended travel, and he was gone 2 days. He returned with the two men under arrest, and with a look on his face that was more tired than she had ever seen him. He filed charges that he fully expected the territorial court to reduce to something inadequate. He was right, but the settlement had not been abandoned, and the message about what Coldwater Creek's Marshal would and would not tolerate had been delivered in terms the cattle operation understood. He came to her that evening and she fed him and sat with him while he was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "You did what you could." "It is not enough," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you did what you could, and that is not nothing, and the people north of here know someone is watching." He looked at her across the small table. "I do not know what I would do without you," he said. "I did not realize how much I needed someone who would simply tell me the truth." She felt the weight of that and held it carefully. "I did not realize how much I needed someone who would simply listen to mine," she said. He asked her to marry him on a February evening, which she would later tell people was either the least romantic setting possible or the most romantic depending on how you viewed it. Specifically, he asked her while they were both standing in the schoolhouse in their coats trying to identify why the stove was not drawing correctly, which turned out to involve a blockage in the flue pipe caused by an ambitious and now regrettable nest of dead grass left by a bird the previous summer. He had been on his knees trying to see up the flue, and she had been holding the lantern over his head, and he had stood up, his face dusty, and he had looked at her in the lantern light with all his feelings visible in a way they rarely were, and he had said, "I want to marry you." She had said, "Yes, but we need to fix the flue first or this whole building is going to fill with smoke." He had laughed. She had heard him laugh genuinely only a handful of times before that, and each time it had the same effect on her, like watching a very heavy door open onto a bright room. She thought later that the laugh was the moment she understood she was genuinely in love with him, not just drawn to him, or impressed by him, or invested in the project of him, but in love, the kind that does not require anything to be different than it is. They told Reverend Abel the next day, who told the town council, and by that afternoon it was the primary discussion at the general store, which in Coldwater Creek was functionally the town's only news distribution system. The responses were warm and occasionally overly enthusiastic, in the manner of small communities that take a proprietary interest in the romantic lives of their most prominent figures. Mrs. Pratt from the boarding house wept openly. The Huang family, whose Saturday evening dinners had functionally hosted the courtship, presented them with a pair of embroidered handkerchiefs and a very good meal. Frank Greer, the homesteader who had been at the center of the Hatch incident, showed up at the marshal's office with a handshake and a jar of whiskey. The wedding was planned for early April, when the worst of the winter would be over and the mountain passes would be opening again, allowing word to travel and a few people to travel with it. Pauline wrote to her father in Cincinnati, who wrote back a letter that arrived in late March, and that she read at the kitchen table of the small house Nathan had rented in anticipation of their marriage, reading it twice because her father's happiness for her was in every line, and made the page difficult to see clearly. But before April arrived, the last and worst crisis came, and it came in the form of a blizzard that no one had predicted and information that had been hidden. It started with a man named Rourke, who rode into Coldwater Creek on a Wednesday at the end of March with a lathered horse and the frightened eyes of someone carrying dangerous news. He was a hand from one of the small ranches to the west, and he had information about a territorial bounty hunter named Cal Mercer, who was 4 days behind him and coming for Nathan Hayes. Mercer, Rourke said, was carrying a warrant out of Missouri, a warrant that Nathan Hayes apparently did not know existed, related to a killing that had happened in St. Joseph in 1875, before Abilene, before the Marshal's years, back in the beginning when Nathan Hayes had been 25 years old and unknown. The warrant was for murder. Nathan received this information in his office, with Pauline standing beside him because she had been there when Rourke arrived and he had not asked her to leave, which she took as a sign that whatever happened next, they were facing it together. She watched his face as Rourke spoke, and she saw something move through him that was not panic. It was more like the settling of a man who has been waiting for something to arrive and now recognizes its footstep on the porch. When Rourke finished, Nathan thanked him, sent him to get his horse taken care of, and sat down very carefully in the chair behind his desk. Pauline did not speak. She waited. 1875, he said, to the room rather than to her. St. Joseph, Missouri. A man named Gilbert Reese. She kept her face still and waited. He told her. Gilbert Reese had been a man who had done things to people weaker than himself for years in a river town in Missouri, specific terrible things that Nathan Hayes at 25 had witnessed, and then had stopped the only way he could stop them given the law's disinterest and the victim's vulnerability. He had not had a badge. He had not had legal authority. He had had a clear conscience and a bad situation, and a man who needed stopping. The stopping had been permanent. And he had left Missouri with the weight of it and traveled west and become something different, someone different, a man who carried the law because he understood from both sides what the law was for and what it cost when it failed. Pauline heard all of this. She heard the full account of what Gilbert Reese had done and what Nathan Hayes had done about it at 25, and she processed it against everything she knew of him. The man who had ridden through a winter storm to make sure she had enough wood, who had arrested the men who destroyed the Shoshone winter cache, who had sat with her in the evenings and told her the truth about Laramie and Clara and the weight he carried. She processed all of it. "What will you do?" she asked. "If the warrant is legitimate," he said, "and if Mercer is a licensed bounty hunter operating under valid territorial authority, I cannot resist arrest without violating everything I have spent 9 years representing. And if you go to Missouri, if this goes to trial," he met her eyes. "It would not go well," he said. Missouri in 1875 was not interested in justice for the people Gilbert Reese hurt. The warrant exists because his family has money and memory, and have apparently spent 9 years looking. The word betrayal seemed to hang in the air between them, not betrayal by Nathan to her, but something more complicated, the betrayal of a young man by a system that forced him into an impossible position, and then followed him with a warrant for filling the void it left. She felt rage on his behalf, and she felt fear for herself, and she felt, underneath both, the bedrock of what she knew about him. "You are not going to run," she said. "No," he said. "I am not going to run." "All right," she said. "Then we are going to fight it, legally, from the beginning. Pauline, the people Gilbert Reese hurt, are any of them alive? Can they testify? Can we get depositions, affidavits, documentation of what Reese was and what he did? Can we build a case for justification, for context, for the jury to understand the full picture?" He stared at her. "That could take months, and we would be waiting," she said. "Yes, together. I have waited for things before." The look on his face in that moment was something she carried with her afterward as one of the most precious things she had ever seen in a human being. It was the look of a man who had been prepared to face something alone and had just discovered he was not alone, and who was not yet sure how to hold that without breaking. "I do not deserve you," he said. "You say that again and I will rescind my yes," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. The arrival of Cal Mercer 2 days later set the whole town on edge. Mercer was a competent professional, hard-faced and businesslike, who presented his warrant to Nathan at the marshal's office while half the town watched through windows. The warrant was technically valid, but Mercer was, as Nathan had assessed him to be, a man who operated within the letter of the law even when the spirit of it was less clear. Nathan presented himself for legal proceedings without resistance, which Mercer had not expected, and which changed the dynamic of the situation in ways that worked in their favor. Because Nathan was the marshal, and because the warrant originated in Missouri rather than Wyoming territory, the question of jurisdiction was genuinely complex, and Nathan requested, through the territorial court in Cheyenne, a determination of proper jurisdiction before any transport could occur. This was not delay, it was legitimate legal procedure, and Mercer, being a professional, accepted it. This bought them 6 weeks. Pauline wrote letters. She wrote to the people she could identify from Nathan's account of St. Joseph in 1875, through public records, through the network of names Nathan remembered, through contacts she made through Reverend Abel's church connections, which crossed the territory and into Missouri itself. She was methodical and relentless, and she did not sleep enough for 6 weeks. She found a woman named Dora Stills, who had known Gilbert Reese, and who had in fact been one of the people most directly damaged by him, and who was still alive and living in Kansas City. Dora Stills' written testimony, obtained through a contact of Reverend Abel's in Kansas City, was 12 pages long and made the Coldwater Creek Town Council, who read it at Nathan's request, uniformly silent for several minutes. They found 3 others: a man, a former neighbor, another woman who had left Missouri for Colorado precisely to get away from the memory of what Reese had done, a former city official who had received complaints about Reese and had failed to act, and who had the decency to feel guilty about it for 9 years, and the further decency to say so in writing when asked. The case went before the territorial court in April, delayed from their original wedding date, in a process that was long and anxious and occasionally terrifying, because for the first weeks Pauline could not be certain how it would end. Nathan faced the proceedings with the same controlled steadiness he brought to everything, but she could see the cost of it in him in the evenings, the tiredness, the old weight back on him with additions. She stayed beside him and was honest with him and did not pretend things were fine when they were not, and she kept working. The territorial court, having reviewed the evidence, made a ruling that was not a full exoneration, but was the closest thing available under the circumstances. The Missouri warrant was deemed insufficient for extradition given the evidence of mitigating circumstances, and the time elapsed, and the court issued a formal finding that the historical record indicated the act in question had been committed under conditions of extreme provocation with no available legal remedy. It was not quite absolution. It was the law doing the best the law could do with a dark and complicated thing, and Nathan Hayes accepted it in the spirit in which it was offered, not as a verdict on his conscience, which remained his own business, but as a legal determination that allowed him to continue living the life he had built. Mercer left Coldwater Creek on the afternoon the ruling came down, professional to the last, without comment or visible rancor. Nathan watched him go from the doorway of the marshal's office, and when the rider disappeared around the bend in the main street, he stayed in the doorway for a moment, and Pauline, who had come to stand beside him, took his hand. He turned and looked at her. He looked at her for a long time with all the things the last 6 weeks had been, and then he said very quietly, "Thank you. You are not going to tell me I should not have done it," she said. "No," he said. "I'm not going to tell you that again." They were married in May, not April, because the proceedings had pushed everything back and because, as Pauline told Mrs. Pratt privately, she had no intention of being married while she was that exhausted. The Reverend Abel officiated in the small white church that was still the newest building in Coldwater Creek, and every person in town came, which was something like 300 people pressing into a building built for 150, and the overflow stood outside the open windows in the clear May sunshine and listened. Frank Greer's wife had made the wedding cake. The Huang family had decorated the church with paper flowers they had made themselves, intricate and colorful against the plain white walls. Billy Crane, who was doing significantly better now that Nathan had arranged for his father to receive some help with his drinking problem through a doctor in Cheyenne, served as the boy assigned to hold the flowers Pauline carried, which she had gathered herself from the creek bank that morning, early columbines still wet with mountain dew. Nathan Hayes at the altar, which was really just the front of the church with Reverend Abel standing in front of a wooden cross, wore his best coat and no badge, which people noticed and which meant something, though no one remarked on it. Pauline came down the aisle in a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from Cheyenne in the autumn, a pale gray blue that her father, in his letter, had said would match her eyes. Nathan watched her come toward him with the same total focused attention he gave to everything important, and she thought, watching his face, that she had never seen him look exactly like this before, like a man who had gotten somewhere he had stopped believing he could reach. They exchanged their vows with the clear voices of people who meant what they said. When Reverend Abel pronounced them married and Nathan Hayes kissed his wife in front of 300 people, and the Wyoming sky outside the windows, the sound from the crowd was something between applause and something more than applause, the particular warmth of a community that has watched two people earn their happiness. After the ceremony and the celebration, which went on considerably longer than anyone had planned and involved Frank Greer's homemade whiskey, and a fiddle player named Old Tom who played until his hands hurt, and then played some more, Pauline and Nathan walked home together in the early evening light. The mountains were purple and gold to the west. The creek ran fast and clear. The town was still visible behind them, warm-windowed and noisy, and ahead of them was the house Nathan had rented and then bought when it became clear that the jurisdiction proceedings were resolved and they were staying. She leaned against his shoulder as they walked, and he put his arm around her, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was not anything that needed to be said. Everything had been said. Everything had been done. They were, in the complicated and costly and beautiful way of people who had earned it, where they were supposed to be. The first year of their marriage was the quietest and also the fullest of Nathan's adult life, and probably of Pauline's too, though she would have expressed it differently. She continued teaching, which she had no intention of stopping, and which Nathan had not suggested she stop, having apparently understood from the first conversation that this was not a woman who needed to be redirected from her vocation on account of a husband. The school grew in the second year. A second teacher was brought in from Cheyenne, and Pauline became the head teacher with additional responsibilities and a corresponding increase in the already modest pay. She was good at it in ways that went beyond curriculum. She was good at seeing children, at understanding what each one needed and finding a way to provide it within the limitations of what a one-room schoolhouse in Wyoming territory in 1884 could provide. Nathan continued as marshal, his authority in the territory having been enhanced rather than diminished by the way the warrant proceedings had been handled. People who had watched him face down a Missouri bounty hunter by doing everything right, by standing still and fighting clean, and letting the law work even when the law was slow and uncertain, had a particular respect for him now that was different from the respect they had always had. He used the authority carefully. He continued to push on the land issues with limited success, but the Shoshone families to the north stayed on their land through that year and the next, and he kept documenting and wiring Cheyenne, and the accumulation of documentation eventually contributed to a territorial review that produced some marginal improvement in oversight, which was not justice but was something. In the late autumn of 1884, Pauline told Nathan she was expecting. He received this information with a stillness that she had learned to read correctly, the stillness of a man feeling something so large that it had temporarily exceeded his capacity for expression. Then he put his hands very carefully on her face and kissed her forehead and held her for a long time in the kitchen of their house while the late autumn light came through the window and the smell of supper was on the air, and she thought she could feel his heartbeat change. "Are you frightened?" she asked, because she was, and it seemed only fair to ask. "Yes," he said. "Are you?" "Terribly," she said, "but also the other thing." "Yes," he said, "also the other thing." Their son was born in June of 1885, on a warm, clear morning when the columbines were blooming again along the creek. He was large and healthy, and announced himself to Coldwater Creek with a vigor that the women who assisted at the birth found greatly reassuring. Nathan Hayes, who had managed gunfights and winter storms and legal crises with controlled composure, sat beside his wife after the birth with the look of a man who had been taken completely apart by something and was finding the pieces surprising. He held his son with enormous careful hands and stared at him in the particular way that new fathers stare when they are trying to absorb a reality too large and too immediate for any prior framework to accommodate. They named him James, for Pauline's father in Cincinnati, with Thomas as a middle name for Nathan's father in Missouri, the blacksmith, who had died years ago but who Nathan had spoken of with affection in a way that told her the man deserved to be remembered in something living. James Thomas Hayes arrived in Coldwater Creek like a small, determined declaration, and the town received him with the warmth that small frontier communities give to new life, which has always been, in places where life is expensive to sustain, something more than social courtesy. It is closer to reverence. The years that followed were good years, which is not to say they were easy. The West in the late 1880s was continuing its complicated transformation, the open range closing, the railroad advancing, the old violent freedoms of the cattle era giving way to something more structured and less romantic and simultaneously more and less just, depending on who you were and where you stood in the new order. Nathan Hayes navigated these changes as he navigated everything, with careful attention and stubborn ethics and the ongoing willingness to say the difficult thing clearly. He also, and this was something that only Pauline fully saw, was becoming someone who knew how to rest. Not just physically, though he was better at that too, but in the deeper sense, the sense of a man who had been running from himself for years and had found, in the life they had built together, enough ground to stand on that the running was no longer necessary. He was still quiet in public, and still the severity was part of him in ways that were structural rather than acquired. But at home in the house on the creek, with Pauline and with James and eventually with the others who followed, he was something other than the gruff marshal that the town knew. He was funny. He was patient in a way that surprised even himself. He told his son stories at night that he made up as he went, long rambling frontier adventures featuring a cast of improbable characters. And Pauline would sit in the kitchen and listen through the open door and feel something so complete and so quiet that she had no word for it except home. James was 3 years old when the second baby came, a boy they named Robert, who arrived in the fall of 1888 with the red hair that nobody in either of their families could account for, and that became, over the following years, his most remarked-upon feature. Robert was a different creature from his brother, louder and more physical, and inclined toward a kind of cheerful chaos that reminded Pauline of no one she knew and Nathan of no one either, leading them to the private theory that occasionally life generates someone entirely new. Nathan, made deputy by that point, had a young man named Cooper, 23 years old, energetic and conscientious, who had come to Coldwater Creek from the Nevada mining territory looking for something more stable and had found it. Nathan mentored him with the careful seriousness he brought to things he cared about, and watching him teach the young man, watching him pass on what he knew about law and fairness and the difference between authority and power, Pauline saw again the quality in him that she had recognized in the first conversation about Billy Crane, the man who understood what things were for. Billy Crane, as it happened, by 1888 was 14 years old and doing well. His father had maintained his sobriety, imperfectly but genuinely, and Billy had grown into a serious-faced, hard-working boy with a particular talent for mathematics that Pauline had been feeding carefully for 2 years with every resource available in a Wyoming schoolroom. She had written to a college in Denver. There was a scholarship program. The distance was enormous and the obstacles were significant, but Billy Crane had the kind of determination that obstacles had difficulty accounting for, and Pauline had the kind of tenacity with institutions that came from years of practice. The winter of 1888 came early, and with the particular ferocity that the first real winter after several mild ones tends to produce, as if the cold had been saving up. By December, it was established as a hard winter by the standards of people who used the phrase carefully, and Coldwater Creek was managing it with the practical efficiency of a community that had been managing hard winters for several years now. It was in December of 1888 that everything in this account arrived at the moment where the story began, at the doorway in the blizzard, at Nathan Hayes standing there with snow packed on his shoulders, and a look on his face that she would carry for the rest of her life. It had started that morning with an argument. They had had arguments before, the honest, productive kind that two people of strong character and genuine engagement with each other's minds will inevitably have, and they had had one or two that were larger and harder, the kind that touched the deep things, the places where old damage lived alongside new love. This one was both. A man named Aldrich had come to town the previous week, representing a mining company with interests in the hills north of Coldwater Creek, hills that sat in proximity to the same valley where the Shoshone families lived. Aldrich was sophisticated in the way of men who had learned to dress colonial enterprise in the vocabulary of progress, and he had presented the company's plan to the town council as economic development, jobs, infrastructure, the future arriving in the form of a copper vein that the survey indicated ran through the northern hills. Nathan had reviewed the survey, had read the company's documents, and had been wiring Cheyenne for a week with concerns about what the operation would mean for the land and the people on it. He had come home the previous evening with the news that Cheyenne was inclined to approve the operation. The territorial governor had interests that aligned with the mining company's interests in ways that Nathan had documented, and that Cheyenne was not interested in having documented. He had been told, politely but without ambiguity, that his role was to maintain order in Coldwater Creek and not to make territorial policy from a marshal's office. He had sat at the kitchen table and told Pauline this, and she had been angry in the clean, direct way she got angry at injustice, and they had talked for a long time about what was possible and what was not. And then she had said something that she believed to be true, and that touched the deep place in him in a way she had not entirely intended. She had said that she worried sometimes that he accepted the limits too readily, that the careful man, the man who stayed within his authority, was also the man who had decided in 1875 that the situation in Missouri was outside his authority until the night it was not, that she wondered if there was a version of this Northern Valley situation that was also not yet outside his authority. He had gone very still. She had heard, as she said it, the edge it had, the suggestion that his restraint was not always virtue, that sometimes it might be something else, the old self-protection dressed in new clothing. She had meant it as something to think about together, not as an accusation. But she had heard the edge, and she watched him hear it too. He had been quiet for the rest of the evening in the way that was not his good quiet, and in the morning he had been up before her, already dressed for the cold, and he had told her he was going to ride up to the Northern Valley to speak with the Shoshone families directly, to hear what they wanted to do, and to document their position for the record before Cheyenne made its final decision. She had said that the sky was looking like more snow. He had said he would be back before dark. She had said she did not think he should go. He had said he needed to go. And there it was, the real argument, not about the mining company or the territorial politics, or even what she had said about his restraint, but the old argument, the one underneath every other argument they had ever had, the argument about how much of himself he was permitted to put in danger for the world outside their door. She had known when she married him that she was marrying a man who put himself between hard things and the people who needed protection, and she had accepted that because it was inseparable from everything that made him who he was. But she had not accepted it lightly, and on mornings when the sky was low and gray and getting lower, she did not accept it easily. He had looked at her across the kitchen with James still asleep upstairs and Robert already awake and making small exploratory sounds from his crib and the fire going and all the ordinary beauty of their life filling the room between them, and he had said, "I will be careful." "You always say that," she said. "And I am always back," he said. She had let him go. She had stood in the doorway and watched him saddle his horse in the cold gray morning, watched him ride up the main street and north toward the hills, and she had told herself that he was a grown man who knew this country and knew his limits and was competent and careful, all of which was true. She told herself this several times through the morning as she taught school and watched the sky get heavier and lower and grayer, until school let out at noon and she came home, and the snow started at 2 in the afternoon, and by 3 it was horizontal. She spent the afternoon and early evening in a state that she would not have described as panic to anyone, but that panic was in fact the precise term for. She had prepared supper, and kept it warm and tended the fire and fed Robert, and answered James's questions about why his father was not home with the controlled calm of a woman, who is carrying a great deal and determined not to show it to her children. She had put James to bed and rocked Robert to sleep and come back downstairs to the fire and the dark windows and the howling storm and the emptiness of waiting. The door burst open, and there he was, this man she loved, this gruff marshal with the snow packed on his shoulders and the raw face and the set jaw, filling the doorway with the blizzard raging at his back. "I got 1 mile out," Nathan Hayes said, "before I could not keep going." The storm had hit harder faster than the sky had threatened, a wall of snow and wind that had come down out of the northwest, with the particular sudden violence that Wyoming weather reserved for situations where it wanted to make a point. He had turned his horse 1 mile north of Coldwater Creek, when the visibility had dropped to nothing and the temperature had plunged, and the horse had begun to communicate in the eloquent way of horses that it was not going to be responsible for what happened next. He had turned, not because he was afraid for himself, or not only, but because he had heard her voice in his head saying, "I will be careful," and he had heard his own answer, and he had understood somewhere 1 mile north of Coldwater Creek that being careful meant coming back. She crossed the room in 4 steps and she put her arms around him, snow-wet coat and all, and she held on. He held her back tight, his arms around her with the force of a man who has been 1 mile out in a blizzard and knows exactly what it felt like and why it mattered that he came back. "The people in the North Valley," he said, his mouth against her hair, "are going to be there tomorrow," she said, "and the day after, and you are going to fight for them for as long as it takes, and so am I, but you have to be here to do it." He was quiet for a moment, his arms still around her. "I said some things this morning that I should have said differently." "So did I," she said. They stood in the warm kitchen with the blizzard throwing itself at the walls and the fire popping in the hearth and their sons sleeping upstairs. And it was not a resolution in the sense of everything being solved, because the mining company was still coming, and the territorial governor still had his interests, and the valley north of Coldwater Creek was still vulnerable. But it was a resolution in the deeper sense, the one that mattered more, the acknowledgement between them of what they were to each other and what that was worth. "I was not ready to lose you," he said, and the words were so plain and so enormous that she tightened her arms around him. "You are not going to lose me," she said, "and I am not going to lose you. We are going to be very old and very irritating to each other, and there is not any blizzard in Wyoming that gets to have a say in that." He made a sound that was almost a laugh and held her tighter, and she thought, not for the first time, that the gruff marshal of Coldwater Creek had more heart than the whole territory could comfortably contain, and that he had given most of it to her, and that she had given most of hers back, and that this was the largest and best thing that had ever happened to either of them. In the morning the storm had blown itself out, leaving a world transformed and white and achingly clear under a blue sky that seemed to apologize for nothing. Nathan Hayes rode north to the valley on a bright cold morning with the documentation he had prepared and a determination that had not diminished overnight. The Shoshone families received him with the courtesy extended to someone who has demonstrated over years that his concern is genuine rather than performative. He sat with them and listened for a long time before he spoke, and what he heard confirmed what he had suspected about what they wanted and what they needed, which was documentation and voice, and the knowledge that someone with authority was standing on the same side of the line. Pauline, meanwhile, did not remain at home. She had been corresponding with a lawyer in Denver, a man named Ellsworth who had taken on several territorial land cases with some success, and she wrote him a letter that morning that was the most precisely argued document she had produced since the weeks of the warrant proceedings, laying out the factual basis for challenging the mining company's application on grounds of inadequate documentation of impact on existing land claims and usages. She was not a lawyer, but she was her father's daughter, and her father had taught her that clear thinking expressed in clear language was a form of power available to anyone willing to do the work. Ellsworth replied inside a week. The case was arguable. He would take it on a reduced fee given the circumstances. The matter went to territorial court in the spring of 1889, represented on one side by the mining company's substantial legal resources, and on the other side by a Denver lawyer, a Coldwater Creek marshal, and a schoolteacher whose documentation was, as Ellsworth told Nathan privately, the most comprehensive he had received from a non-lawyer in 20 years of practice. The court ruled in favor of the existing land claimants. The mining operation was permitted in the hills but restricted from the valley itself, a compromise that was not everything and was significantly more than nothing. The Shoshone families remained on their land. Nathan Hayes wired the result to Cheyenne and received an acknowledgment that managed to be both official and slightly resentful, which he showed to Pauline over supper, and which they found, without saying so, deeply satisfying. That spring, a letter arrived from Cincinnati, from Pauline's father James Wainwright, saying that he had been offered a position at a school in Cheyenne, and wondered if Wyoming was as impossible as everyone in Ohio seemed to believe it was. He arrived in July, a lean, sharp-eyed man of 58 who stepped off the Cheyenne stage into the chaotic welcome of his daughter, his son-in-law, his 2 grandsons, and what appeared to be most of the town of Coldwater Creek, who had heard about the schoolteacher's father from the schoolteacher and were disposed to receive him warmly. James Wainwright and Nathan Hayes regarded each other with the cautious mutual assessment of 2 careful men who love the same woman in different ways and need to establish whether this is competition or collaboration. They established, within about 3 days, that it was collaboration. James Wainwright was a man who valued directness and competence, and Nathan Hayes had both. Nathan Hayes was a man who valued people who told the truth about difficult things, and James Wainwright had been telling the truth about difficult things to classrooms full of children for 30 years. They played chess on Saturday evenings. James invariably won the first game, and Nathan invariably won the second, and the third was always genuinely uncertain, which both of them found satisfying in ways that said something about their characters. Pauline watched them together and felt the particular fullness of a woman who has the people she loves in the same room, something she had not had since she was 15 years old, and had not fully let herself hope for since. She watched Nathan teach her father the names of the mountains visible from the front porch on clear evenings, pointing them out with the quiet authority of a man who knows his country. She watched her father show James the younger how to make the paper boats he had made for Pauline when she was small. She watched Robert attempt to climb everything in sight with the serene confidence of a child who has never been told he could not, and was going to have to learn this lesson eventually through direct experience with gravity. In the fall of 1889, Wyoming became a state. The news arrived by wire and was celebrated in Coldwater Creek with more enthusiasm than organization, which was appropriate for a town that had always been better at living than at ceremony. Nathan Hayes was offered the position of county sheriff under the new state structure, a promotion in both authority and responsibility. He thought about it for 2 days and talked to Pauline, and talked to her father, and talked to Deputy Cooper, who he had by then been preparing for advancement for over a year. He accepted the position and appointed Cooper as the new marshal of Coldwater Creek, which Cooper received with the expression of a young man who has been given something large and is trying to determine if he is ready for it. Nathan told him privately that the feeling of not being ready was not a problem. "The question," he said, "is whether you are committed to becoming ready, and I have been watching you for 2 years and I believe you are." Cooper was a good marshal. Nathan had taught him well. In 1890, a third child arrived, a girl they named Eliza Clara, the Clara for the woman Nathan had loved and lost, and had carried quietly as a reminder of what love costs when the frontier takes it. Pauline had suggested the name herself, which had done something to Nathan that he did not try to put into words, and that she did not require him to. Eliza came into the world small and fierce, and with her mother's gray eyes and her father's jaw, and she was, from the first week, clearly going to be a particular kind of person that the world was not going to find it easy to manage. Nathan looked at his daughter with a love so large it was almost comic, and Pauline looked at him looking at her, and thought that every hard mile between the beginning and this moment had been precisely worth it. James Wainwright Sr., now settled in Cheyenne but spending frequent weeks in Coldwater Creek, held Eliza Clara Hayes and said to Nathan, over the baby's head, "You have done well." It was not the kind of thing Nathan Hayes had been told often, or had been capable of receiving before Pauline. He received it now, met the older man's eyes, and said, "We have." Billy Crane, by 1891, had made it to Denver. The scholarship had come through, assisted by letters from Pauline and a recommendation from Nathan that described the boy's qualities in the spare specific language of a man who does not use words carelessly, and therefore makes them count when he uses them. Billy wrote letters back to Coldwater Creek, long detailed ones addressed to Pauline that she read at the kitchen table with a satisfaction that was both personal and professional, the satisfaction of watching a seed you planted grow into something real. The house on the creek was full in those years in the best way, full of the ordinary extraordinary business of a family that has earned itself, voices and boots and the smell of cooking, and the sound of Nathan telling his made-up frontier stories to 3 children who had very different opinions about the plausibility of the plots. James the elder wanted everything to be logical and would raise objections during the story if the geography did not make sense. Robert wanted more chaos and more explosions. Eliza, even at 2 and then 3, seemed to have opinions about character motivation that she expressed with an insistence unusual in someone who was still learning to conjugate verbs. Nathan Hayes, Gruff marshal and county sheriff and father and husband, handled all of this with the same combination of authority and bewildered affection that Pauline had come to understand was the deepest version of him, the version that had been waiting under everything, waiting for somewhere safe to live. On the evening of their 7th wedding anniversary, they sat on the front porch of their house with the mountains violet in the late light and the creek running silver below them, and the sounds of the children inside being tended by James Wainwright, who had come for the occasion. And Pauline had said, "Do you remember the night you came back through the blizzard?" "I remember every moment of it," Nathan said. "What made you turn around? The real reason, not the one about the horse." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. Then he said, "I got 1 mile out and I understood that the mile between me and you was not a mile I was willing to accept." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "The mountains did what mountains do in the evening light, which is to go on being magnificent regardless of what the people at their feet are doing with their small, important lives." "I am glad," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day I am." The years continued to lay themselves down around them like the rings of a tree, each one adding something, each one building on the last, each one imperfect and real and full of the life they had built with their stubbornness, and their honesty, and their willingness to ride back through the worst, whether rather than keep going away from each other. Nathan Hayes served as county sheriff of what became Carbon County for 11 years, until his youngest child Eliza was 12 and old enough to find it embarrassing, at which point he stepped down with the quiet confidence of a man who knows when a job is done and hands the authority to Cooper, by then a seasoned officer of 42 with his own family and his own accumulation of years on the frontier. Nathan took on the role of Justice of the Peace for the Coldwater Creek District, which required less riding in winter blizzards and more careful reading of documents and mediation of disputes, both of which he was exceptionally suited for. Pauline continued to teach until 1895, and then she took the position of superintendent of the district school system, overseeing 4 schoolhouses by that point, which was a job that required the combination of curriculum knowledge and bureaucratic tenacity that she had been building since she first arrived on a mail coach from Cheyenne with a traveling case and a willingness to be part of building something. She was excellent at it. The district schools became, under her decade-long superintendence, known throughout Wyoming as places where the children of homesteaders and ranchers and shop owners and the children of native families who were beginning to navigate the new structure of state schooling were educated with the same seriousness and the same respect. It was not a perfect system, and she knew it was not a perfect system, and she pushed on its imperfections year by year with the patient tenacity that was her most fundamental quality. Billy Crane came back to Coldwater Creek in 1897 as an engineer, 25 years old, and carrying both his education and his history, with the comfortable integration of a man who knows where he came from and what it meant. He came to visit Pauline and Nathan, and to bring the particular kind of tribute that people bring to the ones who believed in them before they had given anyone reason to, which is the tribute of themselves, of who they became. He sat at their kitchen table and ate supper with their family, and Nathan shook his hand, and Pauline watched them shake hands and thought about the boy who had come to school with a bruise behind his ear and no lunch, and she thought that this was what it looked like when things went right. Not perfect, not without cost, but right. James Hayes the younger grew into a serious and thoughtful young man, with his mother's gray eyes and his father's precision of speech, who went east to university and came back with a law degree and the stated intention of practicing in Wyoming, which he did, eventually in Cheyenne, where he became known for the same quality his father was known for, the quality of fairness without sentimentality. Robert Hayes, red-haired and gregarious and inclined toward the physical world, became a surveyor, a real one, and understood the particular irony of this every time he thought about Desmond Hatch. Eliza Hayes, who had from the beginning seemed to have opinions about character motivation, became a journalist. Nathan Hayes lived to see all 3 of them become who they were. He lived to be 71 years old, which was a considerable achievement for a man who had lived his life in the vicinity of hard things. And Pauline was beside him for all of it, for every morning and every evening and every winter and every spring, for the good years and the hard years and the years that were both at once, which were most of them. She was 63 when he died, on a November morning of the kind that comes clean and cold and clear as glass in Wyoming, with the mountains visible from the window and the creek still running below the house that had accumulated 30 years of their life. He had said to her in the last days, with the simplicity of a man who had spent most of his life careful with words, and now found that all the careful words could be left aside, "You were the best thing. You need to know that. The absolute best thing." And she had held his hand and said, "So were you." After he was gone, she was not done, because she was Pauline Wainwright Hayes, and done was not in her nature. She lived another 14 years, in the house on the creek, surrounded by the children and the grandchildren that Nathan had said he could not have and had been given anyway. She taught for several of those years, not formally but privately, the way women of knowledge teach when they are past the formal structures, in conversations and letters, and the particular transmission of understanding that happens between a person who has lived a great deal and a younger person who is paying attention. She told the story of the blizzard night many times in those years, to grandchildren who found it romantic and to young women who came to her with questions, and to anyone who needed to understand that love, real love, the kind that is built rather than found, is not a feeling that arrives complete. It is a thing that is made day by day, choice by choice, mile by mile, through every hard winter and every necessary argument and every moment when one person rides away and then turns back, not because they are not afraid of going, but because the thing they are going away from is more important than wherever they were headed. "He got 1 mile out," she would say, and there was always something in her voice when she said it, some warm and permanent thing, before he could not keep going. And that, she always said, when people asked what love looked like in the wild country, in the cold, clear Wyoming of her long and particular and irreplaceable life, was exactly what it looked like. Someone turning around in the blizzard. Someone coming back through the dark and the cold, not because it was easy, but because the alternative was a mile further from the person they loved. And 1 mile was already 1 mile too many. And they had understood this in the cold, clear moment when the snow was horizontal and the world was white, and the only direction that made any sense at all was home.